yesterday. Federal Cabinet will meet today to discuss former Prime Minister Scott Morrison's secret appointments to 3 extra portfolios. Joining us live from Melbourne now is the Liberal Senator James Paterson. Senator, good to see you. Thanks for your time this morning. So, starting off, what was your take? What's your take on what's happened here?
Good morning, Peter. Look, I was surprised, as I imagine everyone else was, to read on Saturday morning in the Weekend Australian these excerpts from the new book by your colleagues, your News Limited colleagues, because it doesn't accord with my understanding of the best functioning of the Westminster system, in particular the principles of responsibility and accountability. It is difficult to be responsible as a minister if there's another person sworn in also to your portfolio, and it's impossible to be accountable to the Parliament if the Parliament is not informed that you have been sworn in to a portfolio. So I'm looking forward to understanding exactly what the former Prime Minister's thinking was and what advice he had, that this was the most necessary and appropriate way of resolving this issue. I absolutely understand that these are unusual times and extreme measures were entered into across a range of areas of government, but I'd like to understand why this particular pathway was the only or most appropriate solution to the problems that were presented.
So Anthony Albanese's right to investigate it, in your view?
What I'd like to see is an explanation from the former Prime Minister as to what the rationale was for this and why, for example, acting minister provisions wouldn't have been sufficient in the event that a minister was unwell or unable to discharge their duties. This is a provision which is used in normal times, and I'd like to understand why that wasn't possible to be used. And if it wasn't possible to use, why it wasn't just made public that the Prime Minister was being sworn into multiple portfolios. My appeal to the Labor Party would be, please don't make this unnecessarily partisan. This is a question for the Parliament to consider as to whether what went on during the pandemic we are comfortable with and whether or not we want it to be able to be entered into in the future. And if we're not, then the Parliament can come together and consider possible legislation to address this issue. But if it becomes a partisan exercise, if it becomes a witch hunt targeting the former Prime Minister, then my concern is it'll make that process of potential reform addressing these issues much more difficult.
Okay, so just back on Morrison, he said to my colleague Kieran Gilbert yesterday that since leaving the job, I haven't engaged in any day-to-day politics. But I mean, he's still in Parliament. Is the onus on him to explain himself to his colleagues and also the Australian public?
Peter, it's possible that there is a very good legal and constitutional explanation for this. I can't immediately imagine what that would be, but I would like to provide the former Prime Minister an opportunity to explain his thinking, and I think that's the most appropriate thing. It is unusual that we have learned of these arrangements after the government is no longer in office. It is concerning that it appears that the Cabinet itself wasn't even informed, let alone the Liberal and National Party room or the Parliament or the public, and that some of the senior ministers involved, including Matthias Cormann, were not even informed. Yeah. So I think an explanation is warranted.
Okay. Have any constitutional rules been broken, as you see it?
None that I'm aware of, and the truth is that in our political system, Peter, so much is governed by convention and tradition. And it's actually one of the wonderful things about our system. We really do put an enormous amount of trust in elected officials in the way in which they conduct themselves with the power that we have. And we put in place some appropriate mechanisms to scrutinise that power in the hands of elected officials. That comes under real stress, though, if conventions are not adhered to. And that's why in some other political systems, they're much more prescriptive about those conventions, and they write them down in their obligations that tie the hands of elected officials. Now, my general preference is as much as possible to adhere to the Westminster tradition of convention and tradition. But if it has been exposed as being insufficient, particularly in a time of crisis, then I think we have to look at alternative measures of governing these arrangements.
Well, you mentioned earlier some alternative measures and possibly legislation to look at. What form do you reckon that should take?
Peter, I'm not going to propose on your program this morning, with all due respect to you and your viewers, draft legislation on how to deal with this issue. The point I'm making is that during the pandemic, lots of things happened that none of us would have previously expected would happen in public governance in Australia. And as a parliament and as a nation, I think we have to look back at that whole period and all of the things that happened and consider whether in future crises we want these things to happen again. And one of the examples raised in the reporting over the weekend was the extraordinary, what have been described as godlike powers entrusted in the Health Minister under the Biosecurity Act. And that's something that I think we should examine, whether or not it is appropriate to invest that much power in one individual and whether it is appropriate to exclude those decisions by the Minister from the review of the Parliament. It is much more normal when a Minister makes decisions to allow the Parliament to scrutinise and potentially disallow decisions of a Minister. But in the instance of the Health Minister, in the instance of a pandemic, that's not possible. And so I'm just saying a whole range of these things need to be examined now that we are getting out of the pandemic, moving back to a more normal life. And among those is whether or not this practice of a Prime Minister being able to appoint themselves to multiple portfolios secretly should continue.
The former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, he's said some pretty strong stuff overnight. He called it sinister. You said you're surprised. Are you disappointed in the Prime Minister as things stand at the moment, the former Prime Minister?
As is often the case, Malcolm Turnbull has really overstated his case, and that is pretty ridiculous hyperbole. I don't think there's anything sinister about this. I'm concerned about it. I think we need to look at it very carefully. I think an explanation is warranted. But I believe that Scott Morrison is a well-motivated person, and particularly during the pandemic, was trying to do his best to keep our country safe. So I think we can all recognise that Malcolm Turnbull has an intense dislike for Scott Morrison, and that might be clouding some of his commentary.
Right, and just getting back to your point there, at the time, they were talking and the expectations were that you might have to set up morgues outside hospitals. That's, I mean, I'm not excusing this at the moment as well, the same as you are, but that's kind of the dire scenarios that the country was facing at the time.
You're absolutely right, Peter. These were extraordinary times, and I think we have to be careful not to have too much hindsight bias and say, well, that wasn't necessary, therefore it was inappropriate. I think an explanation is warranted, and I look forward to hearing it at an appropriate time. But I do understand why the Prime Minister and the government was in a difficult position, contemplating many difficult things. And frankly, from the position of a Liberal, we did many things that we wouldn't ordinarily prefer to do in the pandemic, and I think all of that has to be examined, and this is one among many.
Health aside, though, taking resources off Keith Pitt or overriding him when it comes to PEP 11, that's a strange one, isn't it?
It certainly seems unorthodox to me, and it's not consistent with my understanding of how cabinet government is supposed to function. I can't explain as to why that happened in the way it did. Really only the Prime Minister and those that provided him with advice about how that happened are in a position to explain that.
Do you think that should be revisited, by the way, PEP 11?
Look, no, I don't have a view on PEP 11. I'm a Victorian senator. Sure. I'm not intimately across the details of that. I understand there is some legal action pending on it, so I'll leave that to work through its natural course.
All good. Senator James Paterson, good to have you with us this morning. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.